Welcome to Chalk and Talk, a podcast about education and math. I'm Anna Stokke, a math professor and your host. You are listening to episode 39 of Chalk and Talk. My guest in this episode is Dr. Marcy Stein, professor emeritus in the education program at the University of Washington, Tacoma. Marcy has extensive experience with direct instruction. That's with a capital D and a capital I, or DI, and its implementation. What's fascinating is that she had a front row seat during Project Follow-Through, the world's largest longitudinal educational experiment. If you haven't heard of Project Follow-Through, you're not alone. Despite being funded by the U.S. government to identify the most effective instructional methods for lifting children out of poverty, its results, which showed direct instruction outperformed all other methods, were largely ignored. I find this perplexing, and it's one of the key questions I wanted to explore with Marcy. Why were the results overlooked, and why is Project Follow-Through so rarely discussed in education circles? In this episode, Marcy details her involvement with Project Follow-Through. We talk about its design and the results. We discuss the origins, instructional design, and delivery of Engelmann's direct instruction and its impact on at-risk students. Marcy also dispels common misconceptions about DI, emphasizing that it's effective for all students, not just those struggling academically. She even walks us through a typical DI math lesson. We also tackle some listener questions, including how to address varying skill levels in the classroom and what to do when older students lack prerequisite knowledge. Additionally, Marcy shares insights from her experience navigating educational politics as a DI facilitator and ensuring that the pre-service teachers she worked with understood the importance of effective instruction. This episode highlights the overlooked success of DI and underscores the importance of learning from past mistakes, specifically the failure to acknowledge the results of Project Follow-Through. We need to better advocate for evidence-based practices in education. Throughout the episode, several articles and resources are mentioned, and you will find those on the resource page for the episode. Now, without further ado, let's get started. I am honored to be joined by Dr. Marcy Stein today, and she is joining me from Seattle. She has a PhD in special education. She's a professor emeritus at University of Washington, Tacoma, where she is one of the founding faculty members of the education program. She has published extensively on reading and math instruction, curriculum analysis, and textbook adoption. She has considerable experience consulting with teachers and administrators on improving the performance of students who are at risk for academic failure. She also has consulted with state departments of education on how to use research to improve instructional practice, and with schools, districts, and states on the systematic evaluation of reading and math curriculum materials. She's the lead author of Direct Instruction Mathematics and Designing Effective Mathematics Instruction, and I'm really excited to talk to her today. Welcome, Marcy. Welcome to my podcast.
Thanks, Anna. I'm happy to be here.
I'm really excited to talk to you because I understand that you had something to do with the implementation of Project Follow-Through. And I've talked a little bit about this on the podcast in the past, and we're going to get into it in detail here. So before we start with that, what exactly is your relationship to direct instruction? That's with a capital D and a capital I, and Project Follow-Through.
Well, I'm happy to share that with you. I was really lucky to happen upon direct instruction when I went to University of Oregon to get a master's degree. So I initially went there because a very prominent special educator by the name of Barbara Bateman was there. She was prominent in the area of learning disabilities. That was one of the schools I wanted to attend, and actually they gave me money. And I was from the Midwest, so it was a big deal to go to University of Oregon. I had read an article about Engelmann in that little learning magazine about how he critiqued teachers' instruction and a little bit about follow-through and what was going on, who he was. And I thought to myself, well, I'm going to stay away from him because he watches teachers teach, and I didn't know what I was doing. And it was like, no way was I going to get involved. until I got there and saw that there were courses in the learning disabilities sort of area on direct instruction reading, language, math. And Engelman's name wasn't on it. It was Doug Carnine, who became a mentor and close friend. I sat in Doug Carnine's first class. I guess maybe you'd use the word gobsmacked. I was just like, oh my God, this makes so much sense. I had 3 reading courses. I knew I didn't know what I was doing. I just got excited. And I went to him after the first year of my program and said, I want to work for you. So happened that a good friend of mine, another student, had gone to him too. And had she not gotten another job, it wouldn't have been me. I got involved. I became a consultant. Then you moved from consultant to project manager over a couple follow-through sites. Then later on, when there was additional funding, I became director of a kind of a spin-off of follow-through. So I was involved in follow-through from the start. They trained me and they prepared me and they taught me about what teaching is. And I was very lucky to have that just direct, close contact with the direct instructional people.
And we'll get into the details about Project Follow Through today. And I was just going to tell you a story about how I first heard about it and about Siegfried Engelmann. So I've advocated for better math instruction for Canadian kids for many years. And I don't know, maybe about 8 years ago, I was on a radio show. It's called Cross Country Checkup. It's a national radio show. And I was talking about some of the problems in how math is taught. And this woman phoned in because it's a phone-in show. And she mentioned Project Follow Through. And she said, we've known for a long time what works best for kids. And what's happening in the schools is academic child abuse. And I was really struck by that. I don't know who this woman was, but that was the first I ever heard of it.
Engelmann has written a book. I think that one of his books is titled Academic Child Abuse, or a subtitle of it.
Maybe that's where it came from. But yeah, so let's talk a bit about it and let's get into the details. So could you tell us a bit about the origins of DI, that's direct instruction with a capital D and a capital I, and what inspired Engelmann to develop that approach? And it was developed in the 1960s, right?
This is my understanding because I wasn't quite there then, but Engelmann was at University of Illinois. Well, Engelmann, and this has been written about, and I have some resources for you that I can share about sort of his history, that he did all these different things, and he had a BA in philosophy from University of Illinois, and he wasn't an educator. The most direct relationship is that he was working in advertising, and his boss said, I want to know how to sell these candy bars and what do kids pay attention to. He started really being interested in, well, what do kids pay attention to and how would you influence kids and how do you teach them? You'll see stories about him working with his twin boys who are now, grown adults. Kurt Engelmann is the head of the National Institute for Direct Instruction, and Anna Engelmann is part of the Engelmann-Becker Corporation. And there are videos on YouTube with him working with the twins. So he got very excited about what he was kind of figuring out, how to best teach kids. And I think he kind of shopped it around, and it was Carl Bereiter at the University of Illinois who said, all right, I'll give you a chance. So Engelmann and Jean Osborne and a woman named Cookie Bruner, Lacey Bruner, worked together at a Colonel Wolfe school, and they had a little preschool program. And they taught kids. Interested listeners should go on to YouTube and take a look at Engelmann's video teaching. He's not teaching, and to be very clear, he's demonstrating what these little kids can do in math after some instruction in the 60s. That was historic Colonel Wolfe School. They were designing the instruction. They were trying it out. He was invited to do follow-through. University of Illinois wasn't crazy about him, and he needed to find a home. Because of Barbara Bateman, oddly enough, she had gotten her PhD in Illinois. She was the catalyst that brought Engelmann and the direct instruction people out to Oregon, and they found a home there for many years. And Jean Osborne stayed in Illinois. So did Cookie. And so did Link Bruner. They stayed in Illinois. Engelmann went out, and follow through kind of happened. That became the home. One story about that. I met a woman out here who was this amazing teacher who had been in Illinois, who had gotten her master's degree. And she remembers that there were things going on there. They were developing direct instruction. And she said to me, Marcy, they told us that stuff going on down the hall there, we'll kind of ignore that because that's something that's here today and gone tomorrow. And then she told me that she didn't realize that the kids they were teaching in Colonel Wolfe They were kids from economically little challenged community, Champaign-Urbana community, and that she was teaching their brothers and sisters in special ed. And these kids were like, doing this amazing performing. So that's kind of, it started in Illinois. They were invited to join Follow Through because of the results they demonstrated with the little kids in Colonel Wolf's school. And then that led to the rest.
Yeah, and actually, I watched a YouTube video where he was working with kids, and I mean, it's very grainy, right? Because it's a long time ago. But I was kind of amazed because they're just little kids. And he starts off with like times tables and standard algorithms, adding in columns and that sort of thing. And it ends with them solving systems of linear equations and reasoning through these little systems of linear equations, two equations and two unknowns.
I've never taught a math class that I haven't introduced the class with that video, because one of the major criticisms of direct instruction is that it's rote memorization. If you watch that video, you know that there's no way that those little kids could have memorized all of that, within a year or even 2 years of 20 minutes a day. I would have my students count all the things that the kids are doing. And then we can talk about how that was able to happen with the brilliant design that he was testing out at the time.
Yeah, it's a really great video, and I'm going to post a link on the resource page. So let's talk about evidence supporting direct instruction. So first of all, can you give us an overview of Project Follow Through?
Yes, I can. Project Follow Through, people have said and written about it being the largest educational experiment sponsored by the U.S. government. My understanding was that during Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, when he was, trying to build up the society and address issues of poverty, there was Head Start. Most communities who qualified for Head Start dollars got them, and they didn't have that same kind of capital for elementary schools. So they decided, let's do a study. Let's gather together the major models of the time. Let's do an experiment. Let's see what happens. Let's see how far we can get. So communities got to choose their own model. It was never forced on them. So when follow-through funds became available and an economically challenged community decided we're going to go for this, we want to participate, they interviewed people from the different models, and they chose the instructional model that they wanted. There were a range of instructional models. Finally, at the end of follow-through, 9 models were evaluated. They were kind of grouped as a basic skills model, cognitive model, as a kind of a more affective model, just for the sake of talking about them. And then they implemented. Then it was an implementation in 10 years. It was an amazing implementation. It was amazing to be involved in this. Every follow-through school that signed up had a non-follow-through control school in the very same community. That was amazing. So that constituted one of the analyses of the follow-through data. They also then agreed upon measures. All of the directors of all of the models who are being evaluated agreed that these are the measures that we would use to measure student outcomes. And then you implement it for 10 years. The sites that the direct instruction model was implemented in were like amazing. They were just incredibly diverse across the United States. I was the consultant and the project manager for Flint, Michigan. I also went to Williamsburg County, South Carolina. That was a rural community with African-American students. And probably, I think at one time it was the lowest income, the poorest community in the United States by one census. There were 5 schools there, I think, in which DI was being implemented. Flint had 2 schools. There was East Las Vegas, New Mexico. There was Uvalde, Texas. Everyone started Uvalde, Texas now. I went to a site in Arkansas called Flippin, Arkansas. It was a little rural site. So it was implemented for 10 years. And then at the end of 10 years, there was an evaluation. And it really kind of wasn't close. If you look at the follow-through data, if you don't already know, or your listeners don't already know, Jean Stockard and her colleagues wrote a book called All Students Can Succeed. And she basically analyzes 50 years of data on direct instruction, including, starting with follow through.
Okay, so a couple follow-up questions. So there were 9 types of instruction being evaluated, and there was a control group school for each school that had one of the methods. What were some of the other methods like? Was there like a constructivist, an inquiry-based type method being used?
Yeah, I have the models in front of me. There was a behavior analysis model that was grouped with the direct instruction as a basic skills model. So it was different from DI. A lot of people think DI is just kind of purely behavior analysis. It's not. It's more than that. But it's, shares some features. So it's direct instruction, behavior analysis. There was something called TEAM, TEM, and that was a model that I think was a precursor to whole language. It was a language, kind of a language-based language experience model. There was an open education model that was based on the British infant schools. So it was kind of a lot of kid choice on that. There was a model called the cognitive curriculum, and it grew out of a preschool that was in Ypsilanti, Michigan, the Perry preschool. It had been a very popular preschool model, and they had implemented in K through 3. And that was the assumption was that they were teaching sort of more sophisticated cognitive skills than sort of what direct instruction was doing. There was the Bank Street model of education, still exists. It was a follow-through model. Did I mention a parent education model that kind of, I was always told parent education sort of bypassed the schools and worked with the parents. There were a couple others that I am not as clear on. There was something called responsive education, which I don't really know too much about. And Southwest Lab, there was a model out of Southwest Lab that, again, I wish I can't tell you too much about those models. But the range, right? The range of student-directed, teacher-directed, kind of that continuum was there.
And so the cognitive models are those kind of like what we maybe call today the problem-solving approach?
Yes.
You start sort of with complex problems, and it's student-centered, and the children are encouraged to sort of invent their own algorithms kind of thing.
I don't know the details of that model, but yes, I think it would fall under that category of a kind of a constructivist model. Less detailed, less teacher-directed, but yes, a lot of what they would have called problem solving. I can't speak to the details of that model.
Just to make sure that we understand that these different types were evaluated, and what grades were the kids in?
There were kindergarten starting sites and first grade starting sites. I think the kindergarten sites came a little bit later in some of the models, but all the kids were evaluated at the end of third grade. I mean, there were data annually and assessments to annually, but the big fall through evaluation was after you've implemented from K through 3 or first through 3, the end of third grade came the evaluation, the major evaluation.
And then what were the control groups, which was a business as usual group? What will be happening in a business as usual group?
It was whatever was in the school system at the time. Remember, this is the 60s and 70s, so probably a lot of what then, now are called core programs, but then were called basal programs. I don't think there was much teacher-designed programs at that point. I think that was too early for that. So we have a program in the school, and we implement the program.
Did any of the models do worse than the business as usual groups?
Oh, many of the models did worse than the business as usual groups. There's a very stunning graph that's published when you read about follow through. What they did is calculate an index of significant outcomes, and to kind of simplify it, which is the way I understand it, they kind of went, all right, well, how many times did the follow through group beat their control? And they calculated kind of that index, and they, where 0 is, they're the same, no differences. And there are only a few, the direct instruction model, I'm looking at it now, the direct instruction model in basic skills, well, these are how the measures were kind of grouped as well. Basic skills, cognitive skills, affective skills, kind of outperformed their control groups consistently, whereas the parent education model outperformed their control group in the affective measures, so did behavior analysis. There was a little gain in basic skills for both parent education and behavior analysis. Southwest Lab did something with the affective measures, but everybody else, you can see that the business as usual groups were outperforming the instructional models, which had a lot of money. There were a lot of dollars going into those classrooms, and business as usual groups were outperforming them.
And the measures that they tested them on, so you said basic skills. So that would be what we would expect. Like, can you do basic arithmetic and things like that, right?
And they were standardized tests. So it was they used them at that time, again, we're talking the 60s, they used the Metropolitan Achievement Test. And the subtests of the Metropolitan Achievement Test were like word knowledge and spelling and math computations. Those were considered to be the basic skills. The cognitive skills that they put under that cognitive label they were still the subtests of the Metropolitan Achievement Test, but they were the subtests of reading comprehension, math concepts, math problem solving. And then there were affective measures. So they used the Cooper-Smith self-esteem inventory and something called the intellectual achievement responsibility score. And those are the measures that were used to follow through at the time and agreed upon. Note that they were agreed upon by everybody.
And the effective measures, those were like self-confidence and things like that?
Yeah. I have a story about that. That is very telling about DI. I was coming back from Flint, Michigan to Oregon, and Wes Becker, who was the director of follow-through, was coming back from a meeting of directors when the preliminary results from the evaluation were being shared. And so we met up in Chicago, both going back to Eugene, Oregon. And he said one of the interesting things that happened was the direct instruction kids outperformed everybody on these effective measures. And everybody said, that can't be. These kids can't like being involved in this systematic instruction, and that there must be something. I remember him telling me this. There must be something wrong with the measures, right? Well, of course, we know it's a really simple concept that when kids are successful, they feel really good about themselves. So we know that was part of our teaching. That was part of the delivery of instructions, pointing out to kids how smart they are and what they did and what they accomplished and what they can do. You could see that in the videotape when you see Engelman interacting with the kids. Are you smart? Are you worried? Who's thinking? And all that kind of stuff. And yeah, our kids felt great.
Yeah. And I mean, Engelman, when you watch him, he's a very sort of dynamic character, right? This can go a long way with students as well, with the teachers very charming and dynamic. But we're talking in this study, these were just regular teachers, right? And they'd been trained to use DI.
Not only regular teachers, and I've been really kind of harping on this for a while, especially with the math data. The math programs were taught by paraeducators. There were 3, the follow through in the days of big money, you had a teacher and 2 paraeducators. And the typical follow-through classroom, it didn't always happen. I only experienced it once where the teacher decided she wanted to teach the math and not the reading. Typically, the classroom teachers taught the reading program, 1 paraeducator taught the language program, and 1 paraeducator taught the math program. So we got unbelievable math results, and these programs were taught by paraeducators. And that is something that should be paid attention to.
Okay, so just a point of clarification. What's the definition of a paraeducator?
They were the teaching assistants. They were not certified teachers. They were in follow-through. All the paraeducators, at least in direct instruction follow-through, I can't speak to the others. All the paraeducators were hired from the community. I can't guarantee this, but I think they all had high school diplomas. It was a teaching assistant job that they had. You had a teacher and paraeducators in the classroom, and the paraeducators taught. They taught kids math and language, and the language data are credible also.
What do you think it was about DI that made it particularly effective?
Now, this is my opinion of this. Direct instruction is complex. People want to kind of, I think that it's a simple matter of a few details here and there. It's really a very kind of sophisticated kind of approach that involves how you organize your instruction, how you design the instruction, how you deliver it. What most people don't understand, and I am not an instructional designer, I think what makes direct instruction really stand out is the design of the content. I think people try to add some of the delivery kinds of aspects of direct instruction onto content that's not well designed. I don't think you can get very far with that. You can learn how to engage kids. You can learn how to monitor. You can do kinds of things. You can allocate enough time. But I've always said, the scripts were known for scripts. You can script anything. You can script instruction that makes no sense at all. And you can put it in a script. And I've seen it if you start evaluating programs and you see not as intensive scripts as the ones that we have, but you see scripting happening in more and more commercial programs. And you say, just because it's scripted doesn't mean that it's well designed. So my feeling, even though the analysis hasn't, I don't think they pulled it apart. I don't think you can do direct instruction or you can be successful or say you're doing direct instruction if you don't understand the design that underlies all of the instruction.
And we'll get into that a little more in just a bit. So, okay, we have this large study. It was the largest educational study ever done. Clearly, direct instruction outperformed all the other models. And there's other evidence because Stockard has done some sort of a meta-analysis on it, right? But why weren't the results of Project Follow Through widely adopted? Like, that was the entire point of the study, was it not? The entire point of this study was to figure out the best ways to teach children to lift them out of poverty. Why weren't the results adopted?
Well, that's the million-dollar question now, isn't it? That's the question that's been haunting direct instruction people for 50 years. And I don't know. I mean, when I explain direct instruction when I, do an overview of it or and then to give a talk or even the introduction to, my teacher preparation program, like I mentioned earlier, I'll say these are organization and management details, how you set up a classroom or school, or to do implementation. I talk about design and I talk about delivery. And I've often added another section called politics. And it's the politics of education. And it just seemed that something that this systematic and this scripted and it was not very well understood. And it certainly was threatening to the mainstream, what's been going on in education. And it just didn't fly. And it's the same. I mean, you can see it happening throughout all of education where how many years have we been talking about the science of reading? We've had different names for it. We've had, research-based and evidence-based and scientifically based, and now the science of reading, and it's been the same stuff in terms of beginning reading. Why is that? Why is that in it? Why have people not figured out that, you can teach this little piece of decoding really easily and without a lot of hassle if you just do a few things? I don't know. I mean, I wish I knew the answer to it. It seems people perceive it as being offensive to teachers. People see it as being not allowing teachers to be creative. They see it as being too rigid and too structured. They see it as not being fun. They see it as being rote. Because if you just see the delivery of direct instruction, you make that assumption that it's memorization when it's not. I don't know. I mean, there doesn't seem to be that kind of respect for the science that underlies this. And I don't know how else to answer it.
Yeah, I find it all rather unethical, I have to say.
Yes, I agree with you 100%. In fact, when I'm teaching when I have my little teacher prep students, and it's like, you don't get to decide how to do this. You need to look at your kid data. If I walked into a classroom as a consultant and kids were performing using whatever it is they were using, I don't say a word. But all these years of talking about kids who from economically challenged communities across, quite diverse, but this rate not performing, how do you deal with that? And that's one of the things that Engelman did. He kind of inspired you. Boy, he would give talks. The National Institute for Direct Instruction was a conference every year. But every year, Engelman would do the closing. Even though you've heard it, it would be very moving because it was like, that's somebody's kid. That kid that's in your classroom, that's somebody's kid in that classroom, and you cannot take that lightly. Here's the way you could get behind it, too. I feel incredibly grateful that I can be as passionate about it now as I was when I was starting out, because I know kind of some things to do that would get you there. If I was lost and I didn't know and I was grasping at straws, but I do know some things you can do to get there. Not that it's easy. And it's like, and we know some things. So yeah, I agree with you. I think it's unethical to continue to do things that don't work for kids.
Let's get into it. Let's talk a bit about what direct instruction is so that everybody knows what we're talking about. The first place to start, I think, is what's the difference between direct instruction, capital D, capital I, and just lowercase direct instruction or explicit instruction as it's often called?
I will give you a reference that you can post. It was published in 2017, and the senior author is Charlie Hughes from Penn State University. He wrote an article with several colleagues, and it's called Explicit Instruction, Historical and Contemporary Contexts. And it's in it's Learning Disabilities Research and Practice, and it's a lovely historical piece about what does explicit mean, what is little DI, what is big DI, what separates out little DI from big DI? It's the curriculum. It's the design of the curriculum. It's what it is that the content that you're teaching the kids. That's very simple. Little DI to us is kind of constitutes the delivery aspects of direct instruction. Stuff that you would do. I remember when I was a doc student, it came out of this kind of research area that was looking at correlational research between, what teachers did in classrooms, observational research, and what seemed to be related to kid performance. And it was like engagement. It was like, that's the old term academic engaged time. What were kids doing when they were sitting in the classroom? That's kind of all delivery stuff. So in my mind, little DI, it's delivery. It's kind of important monitoring and checking for understanding and engaging and reinforcing and doing all that kind of, good stuff with kids and interacting with kids. But it matters what it is what you're teaching. So that's where big DI comes.
So they intersect at the delivery piece. The delivery is essentially, very similar, but in the capital D, capital I, there's a content piece.
Delivery necessary, but not sufficient.
Got it.
One of the questions I think we talked about at one point was, can you do DI with programs that are already in the schools? Yeah, no. You can get close. If it's a phonics program, you can do some stuff with delivery, another phonics program, not a DI. But the answer is mostly no.
The two main features really then are instructional design and delivery of the instruction. So let's talk about those. So what are some of the main features of instructional design in DI?
Here's how I think about it. As we mentioned, I've been working with direct instruction since I was a kid for 50 years now. I'm not an instructional designer. I really can't do what they did, because what people don't see is a phase is the very beginning of all instructional design, which is an analysis of content. And it's this very sophisticated sameness analysis. What's the same about topics in math? What's the same about addition and subtraction and, missing add and addition? What's the same about, all the fraction skills that you have? What's the same about, how would you teach fraction skills that would lead you to teaching for kids to understand decimals? So this analysis that gets done prior to designing teaching procedures. And that's the brilliance of direct instruction. I could write an okay, decent program. I know enough about basic things about programs, but the kind of analysis that they did in all of the content areas, they've done it over and over and over again, is really quite striking. And in my mind, there are actually only a few people who know how to unfortunately, there are only a few people who know how to do that. So once they do this analysis, then you get to break it down. Here's something that confuses people. Everybody thinks DI is just a task analysis. Oh, no. No, you don't say, well, this is how I multiply, so I'm going to break down the steps. Everyone thinks it's a simple matter of breaking down the steps and then teaching the steps and scaffolding the steps. It's what comes before the task analysis. It's the analysis of the strategies that you decide you're going to teach your students. It's how efficient those strategies are, how generalizable those strategies are, and what mileage can you get from them. Once you get those strategies, then you break it down into a task analysis.
So you want to sort of pick the most generalizable strategy. Okay, so you mean something that would work best in most situations. Probably also, like when I'm teaching, I try to teach the strategy that's likely to work the best for most students based on experience. So is that kind of what you mean?
Well, not necessarily for students. All right, let me give you an example of a generalizable strategy. I'll give you a little basic one. I like this one. It was in the very first math program. So they decided they're going to teach kids how to add, right? Not math facts. Let's keep math facts separate. This is all the conceptual stuff. They're not using activities. They're using line drawing. So eventually they're going to have the kids read a statement, 4 plus 6 equals how many? The very first step is circle the side you start counting on. And the kids learn a simple rule. You can't start counting on the side with a box. So they read the statement and they circle the side with 4 plus 2, 9 equals how many? There's a box and they teach the kids to say how many when they see a box. And then there are a set of steps that they do for teaching kids how to solve that problem. So how many do you have in the first group? 4. Write 4 lines. And then they use that, and we'll get into this too, because this is an important part of design, vocabulary. And they say, okay, what's next? What does plus tell you to do? It tells you to draw more lines. So what's the next group? How many do you have in the next group? 2. 4 plus 2 equals how many? Draw 2 lines. Very important. Now they say, let's figure out how many you end up on this side, because they learn a rule. You must end up with the same number on this side and on the other side of the equals, right? Language is very carefully controlled. The kids add the lines. Later, they learn how to do it the fast way, 4, 5, 6. How many did you end up with on this side? 6. How many do you have to end up on the other side? 6. And they draw lines. They draw lines under the box, because the lines under the box tell what goes in the box. Okay, they do that. It took about 67 lessons to get there. They're drawing lines for numerals. They're doing simple identification. They're learning the rule about equals without computing. There's a 6 on this. There's a box on this. Just sort of what the idea is, the application of the rule. They're doing all of those prerequisite skills, and then they're going to put them together in this strategy, right? This is procedure that they go through. And the kids should have mastered each one of these individual little prerequisite skills before they ever put them together. The reason they do that is that's the same strategy that they can do for missing, add, and addition, and for subtraction. And you look at the side, you circle the side you start counting on. So let's do 4 plus how many equals 6. Every low-performing kid is typically, in a typical program, is going to add that 4 and add that 6 at the end and put them in the box, and it's going to be wrong, right? And they learn the rule without knowing anything about equality. You take 2 numbers, you put them in the box. They haven't learned how to discriminate when you do that, how you do that. Well, it's the steps, the application of the steps. Circle the side you start counting on. Oh, you can't start counting on the side with a box, so now you're starting counting on the side with 6. How many did you end up with on that side? 6. How many do you have to end up on the other side? 6. Do you have 6 in the first group? Maybe you only have 4. Start with 4 and end up with 6. Draw the lines under the box. That's why they even have that set. The lines under the box tell what goes in the box. Then the same thing with subtraction. You could do subtraction a couple of different ways, but it's, again, what side you start counting on, how many do you have in the first group? What does a minus tell you to do? It tells you to either cross out, or it tells you to count backwards. There are 2 different ways. Make the sides equal. One strategy that applies to 3 operations.
You want a strategy that's going to apply to a lot of examples. Okay. That's interesting, because that was one thing I noticed when my kids were young that I thought was kind of crazy, is they were encouraged. In fact, it's written into our, what you'd call standards. We actually call that a curriculum here in Canada, that students should learn multiple strategies for everything. My observation is that the students never really become good at anything, and they get confused because they don't know what strategy to apply in what situation. I mean, this is even done with math facts, right? Like, count up from a double. Oh, that doesn't work in this situation, so you do something else.
It makes me crazy. Yes, I agree with you 100%. Or create your own strategies. Not only try multiple strategies, create your own strategies. So even if you got the answer to this problem with your little peers that you're working with, there is no guarantee that what you did is going to help you answer the next problem. And the big classic example of that is, I remember seeing somebody had a slide, and it might have been Bernie Solano's slide. You want to find 1/3 of 12. Oh, well, you divide 12 by 3, and you can, find 1/3 of 12. You can't do that if you want to find 2/3 of 12. You can only do that if the numerator's 1. And then you have to go through all this teaching to show kids, oh, no, here's when you can do it, or why you would do it, or how you would do it. It's a waste of time. And I will tell you, one of the tenets of direct instruction is, if you want to catch kids up, kids who are walking in the door because they, a little bit behind because of their situation, then you have to teach more in less time, and it has to be efficient. And having kids explore or apply multiple strategies that don't always apply to certain examples and one didn't apply, you can do it later. You can teach kids that there are multiple ways to solve problems, but if you can get them good at solving one way that is much more applicable and gets you mileage, why wouldn't you do it?
And that's a big one for me, the multiple strategies, because I think, again, it's just they're not getting good at using one strategy.
Exactly. I actually think sometimes this happens because teachers are not well prepared. They don't I know that the elementary teachers that I always worked with all felt like, oh, I'm an elementary teacher because I'm not good at math. Right? I mean, I would hear that all the time. So they're doing what people are telling them to do or what the program tells them to do.
Yeah, I know. That's why it's good to have a good background in math if you have to teach math, because you need to see through the nonsense, right? By the way, on that note, the thing that I often hear is no one student learns in the same way. Therefore, you should give multiple strategies so that the students can choose which way works best for them.
I'm not aware of any evidence that suggests that that's true. Here's how we think about kids and the differences among kids. Engelman has always designed instruction for what he would call the naive learner. If you don't already know something, here's how we're going to design it, right? We're going to make sure that you have the prerequisites and that you understand, how to put it all together. How we think about kids is how fast they pick it up. So some kids acquire these strategies really quickly. They need one example. They got it. You move them along. And some kids need hundreds. So the difference among learners that are relevant to us are differences in how fast something is acquired and not how they learn it. We know that learning styles has been debunked. We know that, all these kind of trying to attend to the characteristics of the learner. He designs instruction and has designed instruction independent of the learner. But what's important is he always field tested his designs. So he designed his instruction for a naive learner, then he went out and then they put it in front of kids, and then they figured out, oh, wow, we see these mistakes we have to fix. It's our responsibility to fix them. We went back, we fixed them, we go back out again. Very few big commercial programs are field tested with respect to the outcomes of students. They were field tested because teachers are going to try them out and find grammatical errors or something, but they're not, and they're almost ready to be published. They're not field tested with respect to whether or not they work. And that's what they did. So no, it's a romantic notion. Oh, we're all different. Yeah, well, we're more alike than we are different. And, one of the really salient differences is how fast we pick it up. And that pretty much depends on also kind of what you walked in the door with also.
We should talk about instructional delivery, because I think there are actually a lot of misunderstandings about that. So can you talk about the main aspects of instructional delivery in a DI program?
Sure. So, as they're figuring this out, and this came to them like after they kind of started writing programs and field testing these programs and figuring out how to deliver them. One of the things about instructional delivery, of course, is there's a script. So the teachers are taught the script. You are not supposed to read the script. You're supposed to kind of know enough how to, kind of look at the script when you need to, and then kind of look at your kids. So when we're preparing teachers to teach DI, looking at teachers watch their kids and monitor their kids as they're teaching, it's hard. Direct instruction programs are more difficult to teach than other programs. And one of the reasons they're more difficult is that you have to coordinate all of these things. You have to get good at them because you have to bring kids to mastery during every lesson. And if you don't do that, because it's such a tightly knit design, that if you get to lesson 62 and you haven't taught 1 through 61 well, you can't go forward. I mean, kids have to master what's being taught. So you're delivering the instruction. With little kids, we use a lot of choral responding. What people don't understand about choral responding is it increases the amount of practice that kids do, but you never trust it. You check choral responding by giving individual turns. I think I'm teaching it. Everybody's answering. I'm giving a signal. Why am I giving a signal? Because if I don't give a signal for everybody to respond at the same time, Marcy's going to go first, and then everybody's going to listen to Marcy. But you have to check. You have to then say, okay, I'm going to spot check these turns. And if any of the kids make errors, you're going to go back and you're going to correct the group. You do that with younger kids whose written skills aren't as unsophisticated. As the kids get older, you can teach in larger groups. So younger kids, smaller groups, homogeneous groups so that kids can move faster. And so the skills are you give a signal, you monitor kids while you're teaching how to correct errors when a kid makes an error, and what do you do, and how do you correct the group? How do you bring kids to mastery? How do you ensure that when you leave your lesson that day, kids have mastered the skills that they were supposed to master that day they were performing? And it's seductive. Because there is repetition in the program, it's very easy for a teacher to say, oh, they're going to get it tomorrow. I'm not going to keep going. If you don't understand how that, and it's a very sophisticated skill to ensure that kids are brought to mastery. Those are all delivery skills.
How would teachers deal with these varying abilities? Like, is it really realistic that you could bring every kid to mastery?
Yeah, it's grouping.
There's some sort of flexible ability grouping going on?
Yes, there definitely is, especially with younger kids. So you really want sort of homogeneous grouping, and you can do this grouping in different ways. I mean, it doesn't have to be three, in kindergarten or first grade, you can, typically have 3 groups, say, and you have a kind of a high performing group, and you have a kind of a middle performing group, and you have a group that, these kids need much more practice and much more repetition. I will tell you on that one of the issues about grouping, and it's always been very controversial, is that these poor kids in the low group never get any better, or they always feel bad. And it's like, that didn't happen in follow through. Our kids who were in the group, and they knew that they were in a book that, the other kids were in a different book, but they knew they were going to get there because they were successful in the groups. I think the grouping literature failed to account for the fact that the kids in the low group never got any better. They were in the same materials that were not very well designed. The high-performing kids, it didn't matter for them. The low-performing kids, it did. So suddenly everybody doesn't want to do grouping because these poor low-performing kids never get any better. Well, they didn't in ill-designed programs, but in our programs, they did. So yes, when the kids are little, you group them. When they get older, you can do things like, if you're going to teach a math lesson and you're going to do it to the whole class, you might have a subset of kids for whom you pre-teach some of the critical content. And then you put them in the whole class instruction. You set them up. People like to wait till afterwards. We're going to do whole class instruction, and then we're going to, okay, now let's take the kids. And I'd much rather do it ahead of time. So that makes the time spent in the whole class much more valuable. If they're sitting there and they don't know what they're doing, and then you don't know that until you pull a few kids out and work with them, you play around with the resources that you have, the time that you have, but when the kids are younger, you group them, and if they're flexible, if you find kids that need to move and these kids can go faster than you previously thought, or in the first 2 groups are kind of commensurate. It's always that challenging lower performing group that you need to pay attention to. But yeah, there are ways to implement in schools to make sure that all kids' needs are being met. There are definitely ways that you can orchestrate that and attend to make sure that everybody's making the kinds of progress you want them to make.
So on a related note, let's say you're a grade 8 teacher and, the students have had various educational experiences before they get to you. And now you have a class of grade 8 students and a quarter of them don't know their times tables. And so do you just go ahead with the algebra lesson? Or do you make sure these kids get caught up on the skills that they missed?
Okay, so the harder, the older the kid, the harder it is, right? To make sure that all the kids' needs are being met. And I think that's when you sort of take account of a kind of a school-wide implementation. What is our approach to addressing the needs of these kids? Okay, couple alternatives. Kids don't know their multiplication tables. They need to know them. I'm going to take those kids who don't know them, and I'm going to figure out a way to do that separately. But while I do that, I'm going to give them a way to answer. So if they need to have a cheat sheet for multiplication tables, then I'm going to do that, right? And I'm going to I'm not going to take away from the algebra lesson unless they really can't make it because of the other content. And then I'm going to do math facts stuff. Math facts stuff, which I know that's one of your things, is just critical. I agree. And how do we do it? You can do a math facts kind of buddy lunch. You can do tutoring with math. Well, you've done it. You've talked about all the ways that you can design instruction for kids to bring them up on their math facts. That we know how to do. But if the prerequisite skills that they need are so enormous, then yeah, I don't think I keep them in that algebra. I think I might try to divide up my group. I think I might try to say, what other resources do I have? What other teachers am I working with? Am I working in the States? Am I working with title teachers? Am I working with special ed teachers? Is there a floating paraeducator to whom I can give some instruction? I don't really like the idea of kids sitting in grade level materials who can't master them. It's just such a waste of time. And it seems like people do that where they need to be exposed. Well, exposure is a waste of time. To think that exposure to these concepts somehow will get through down the line has never been borne out. So sitting in an instructional session where you can't participate, it just makes no sense to me. So what are your resources? What is the school doing? Do you have an after-school program? Do you have a pre-4 school program? What kind of volunteer program do you have? Do you have high school kids coming in to do a volunteer thing? There are ways to do this, but they're not quick and dirty. And I'll tell you, with all the tutoring things, this is a pet peeve. It can't be once a week. I ran an after-school program in Tacoma Public Schools in one school, and I had undergraduates come and twice a week. So this little group of students had a Monday and Wednesday and a Tuesday and Thursday tutor, but we had made sure that they had instruction after school for 4 days a week. And so this once a week, or this, I'm going to be your buddy. If you're going to do this, take it on, you can do it.
Yeah. So the prerequisite skills really need to be addressed. Otherwise, it's really a waste of time to have students sitting in a lesson that they can't keep up with. Because again, as we've discussed many times on this podcast, math is really cumulative. It's also very demoralizing, I think, for students. So yeah, I agree with what you're saying. If there are ways to get students caught up on those prerequisite skills, that makes the most sense.
The prerequisite skills to the strategies that you're teaching, to the concepts that you're teaching, and math texts are part of that. The other prerequisite skills, I don't know, you have to really kind of understand your content well enough to know, what am I spending time on, and is this going to help with this? It's a whole different ballgame when you're talking about more sophisticated content. Math facts, for sure. You can do it. We know how to do it.
Definitely. So, and on that note, a similar thing that you've talked about are spiral curriculum, like a spiral curriculum, versus what DI does, which is a strand curriculum. So can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, I think it's kind of very important. So the people I think were thought about when they think spiral, they think that's a really great thing. They think, oh, look, it's going to come back. It's going to review. Except for the fact that a spiral curriculum spiraled across years. So you had a fractions chapter in first grade, and another fractions chapter in second grade, and another fractions unit chapter, part to your math curriculum. So every year you have to review what came the previous year, then add a little bit more. Review what came. There's no way that one little unit on fractions was going to maintain for a full bunch of kids, right? That they were going to maintain those skills if they were taught well. So spiral, the fallacy about spiral is that it's a whole year before you get it again. Strand, when the direct instruction designers decide to teach content in their programs, they analyze the content, and then they build a strand for that content. And that strand also integrates with other strands. And that's where the whole integration and the whole systematic instruction comes in. So once something is introduced, it's taught to mastery, it's then practiced, it's maintained, it's integrated into some other skill that requires that kids know that. And it doesn't die. When something is targeted for instruction within a given level, it's just, you go the distance. So any direct instruction lesson, and this has been kind of talked about a lot lately, only has 15% new content in it. 10 to 15%, 15 to 20, some small amount of new learning is happening, is the introduction to something new. The other stuff is either it's somewhere along that strand. It's either now it needs a little bit of assistance, but not as much assistance as before. Now it's going to be practiced independently. Now it's going to be integrated into something else. So the strand moves and it gets much more, it starts out very teacher directed, and then it ends up independent, and it ends up integrated into something else. So strands, you just see it throughout the entire level that you're teaching.
Would you be able to sort of walk us through like a typical DI math lesson structure?
There's a program called Corrective Math, and it's been around a long time, and it was designed as an intervention program, and they're modules, like 70 lesson modules. There's addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, basic fractions, percents and decimals and percents, and ratios and equations. Those are the modules. What you need to know about a DI lesson is it has many tasks. So it's not a lesson on one topic like many math programs are. Today we're doing fractions, or today we're doing adding and subtracting fractions with unlike denominators, and we're going to spend 45 minutes on that. It's never like that in a DI lesson. So here's lesson 40 out of 70 lessons in the module fractions, decimals, and percents, okay? And here are the tasks. Here are the exercises. The first exercise is multiplication, addition, subtraction, and division with fractions and mixed numbers, okay? So it's practice. The teacher prompts a little bit and leads kids through some things. Exercise 2 is fraction relationships, and they're talking about equivalent fractions. Exercise 3 is decimal notation, and they're looking at problems and they're writing fractions as decimals, and the teacher's leading them through. Exercise 4 is another part of decimal notation. Exercise 5 is multiplying decimals. Exercise 6 is a continuation of less structure, multiplying decimals. Exercise 7 is a work check. That's what your 45-minute lesson looks like. Teacher-directed instruction. And the teacher-directed instruction, I always talk about the scripts and the teacher-directed part of the instruction as being on a continuum from being highly directive to systematically reducing that assistance. And you do a work check, and you never send kids back to their seats unless you're sure they can do it. And what we call formats, the scripts are formats. There's structured formats. There's less structured formats. There's guided practice where we're watching, and then there's independent. And when kids make errors, you move within that continuum. You see some errors, at their seats, you come back and you watch them to see what caused those errors. If you're in less structured, you reduce some of the structure. You're highlighting a couple critical discriminations. Oh, I want to remind you about this. Now let's do these, and the kids can't do it. You go back to the structured. So you move within this sort of continuum of, and that's what people don't see, actually. When they see direct instruction going on, you see teacher-directed instruction, and unless you know that there's variation in the amount of support, there's scaffolding built in to the program. The scaffolding is, teachers don't even have to think about it as much as if you implement and know how to correct if you're making errors, the scaffolding is built in. The structure is systematically reduced in the formats themselves. That's a lesson looks like that, at least this intervention. These tasks, little bit new, lots of practice, some things that the teacher's going to lead, some things the teacher's going to back off a little bit.
So is there like a teacher guide that goes along with it, and the teacher reads how to do the lesson, and it's completely scripted, as you say?
Yes. Yeah. The teacher's guides in DI are actually the descriptions of the programs. They're not the lessons. So there's a teacher's guide to fractions, percents, and decimals. It explains everything. It explains the strands. It shows where you're going. It's not huge. It's really informative. And we really take people when they're first learning how to do DI, we kind of say, okay, look and see what's in here. It's not just sales, material. It's not just discussions. This is how you do this program. And most of the questions are answered in there. Then there's what we call a teacher presentation book. Those are the lessons, and they're the scripts. And there are the directions, and then, what the teacher says is in blue, and what the kids say is in black. And then you learn how to implement that.
Okay, so you mentioned corrective math. So that's one of the sort of DI programs. Are there others that people use?
Yeah, you mean math programs?
We only care about math on this podcast, don't you know? I just talk about math because that's what I know about.
That's right.
But yeah, math programs.
Well, the quote developmental program is Connecting Math Concepts. That's the name of the program that has a, K 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I don't know. There's not a K. The very first math program that ever existed was called DISTAR Arithmetic. And I think you can buy DISTAR Arithmetic 1. There were 3 levels, but that's the only one you can buy, and it's used in a lot of kindergartens. It's kind of close. When we're doing that line drawing example, draw these lines, that was from DISTAR Arithmetic 1. So there's Connecting Math Concepts, which has many levels. There's Corrective Math, which is designed as an intervention program. DISTAR Arithmetic, which was the original program. There's a program called Essentials for Algebra that was designed, again, Bernadette Solano and Engelman wrote this Essentials for Algebra. And the idea was if kids could get through this, and it's tricky, but if they can get through it, they could pass any exit tests that they needed to pass. It's pretty interesting. And those are the main DI math programs. People can learn about them on the NIST website, by the way, the National Institute for Direct Instruction. There's a link, a drop down. Here are the programs, here are the math programs. They usually have placement tests, like for free. You can to see if would your kids fit in this, or where would they fit.
What about Essentials for Algebra? Does that one still exist?
Oh, yeah.
I think everybody listening should go and get that one. That's what I'm always harping on about, is just prepare kids for algebra, because algebra really sets people up for later success. If you want to go on and do more math, you have to have really good algebra skills. But the thing is, it goes quite far back. Preparing students for algebra starts when they're quite young. So I'm going to check that one out. So what are some of the biggest misconceptions that you've encountered about DI?
They're really common. We mentioned one. It's rote. It's not rote. Bob Dixon, who wrote the spelling program, the smartest spelling program around, called More for Rapid Spelling, said he defies anyone to find something that's taught by rote in a direct instruction program that can be taught any other way. So yeah, you have to know that this is a 4, right, and what it means, and that's rote. So 1, that's the biggest, that it's the rote instruction. 2, that it's nothing more than a task analysis and breaking it down into smaller steps. Yeah, you do that, but you don't do that until you have a really sophisticated analysis that precedes that. 3, that it's not fun. I can tell you that I can get kids jumping out of their seats, with these programs. I would see that teachers want programs that motivate kids. And it's like, yeah, you'll be looking forever if you think that motivation comes from the program. Motivation comes from the teacher. And if you don't understand about how to interact with kids and get them excited and challenge them, and even older kids, you'll be looking for that motivating program forever. So motivation is where you can be creative. Motivation is where you can be clever. Motivation is, here's where you're using all the behavioral principles that setting kids up for success. So again, this whole creativity thing, many people have written about this. I have such respect for instructional design. As I've mentioned, I'm not a designer. And why we expect teachers to do that is kind of beyond me. There are very few teachers who have had classes in instructional design. And even if they did know about instructional design, have the time to engage in it, let alone test out whether or not their design works. So this notion that you're supposed to come up and design instruction is I think, just a fallacy. I think it's too hard on teachers. So there are plenty of other areas in which you can be creative, even, including the motivation aspect, but not in designing really critical instruction. There are designers who know how to do that. Kids like it. Kids like it depending on how a teacher teaches it, right? And kids feel very successful. And
yeah, at the end of the day, we want students to be successful, right? You want to use the approach that is most likely to generate success for the most number of students. So that's what it's about.
And the older the kids are, the more you have to, in my experience, point out that success, Because, see, they failed for so many years. So you talk about that eighth grader, right? Who's in eighth grade. Well, somebody's told them that they're going to teach them math for 7 years. And guess what? They haven't. And the kids don't feel confident because I don't know what I'm doing. So now the eighth grade teacher says, I'm going to do it. And it's like, yeah, show it. Yeah, I dare you, prove it to me. And I'm a little kid person, can get the little kids excited, but you can do the same thing but you have to deliver. If you want kids to engage, you, the teacher, has to be able to deliver in such a way and point it out. You couldn't do this yesterday, and look what you can do today.
My understanding is that, there's some resistance to structured programs like DI. It's a very structured program. Why do you think there's this resistance, and what can we do about it?
And there's this fear. And there's a fear of being too systematic, and there's a fear of what you don't know. It means a big sea change for people, right? The only thing that I can do, it's like you and I talked about, and we feel strongly, it's like there's this ethical component. Let me tell you this, that I do understand this. So if they're classroom teachers, general education classroom teachers, and they have a class of 30 kids, and 20 of their kids are learning whatever this classroom teacher is teaching, regardless of what the instruction looks like, and 10 kids aren't, the teacher has to decide, is it me or is it the kids? Well, if 20 are learning regardless, they go, oh, well, see, it's the kids. It's these 10 kids. When I was doing teacher prep, I used to kind of share a bias that I thought really good teachers were those teachers who could teach the hardest to teach kids. In my value system, that's what a really good teacher does, right? And I've always worked with kids who have challenges. So whether these challenges are economic or learning challenges, but that's my value system. I tell it to my teachers right off the bat. So you have to flip that. So teachers have to understand that those 20 kids may or may not have gotten it. And math, it's really funny because in math, it doesn't occur like reading. So once kids can decode, then you have all these kids engaged in all these programs that may or may not teach anything. In math, you have a whole bunch of kids who are not economically challenged who don't know math. I mean, it's a different thing. It's not just economically driven, like a lot of it is in reading, which is fascinating to me. And years ago, there was a grassroots movement in Washington State called Where's the Math? There were a couple of these grassroots movements around. There was one in New York. There was one in California. And the one, I went to a session with these parents about their kids' math instruction. And it was fascinating because who was sitting in the audience? Boeing engineers and professors and scientists. And they were sitting there saying, hello, I'm a Boeing engineer and my kid I don't understand this math instruction. And why are you teaching math this way? Hi, I'm a, research scientist at the University of Washington. And there was a mathematics professor, I think, who told the Seattle Public Schools, you may not teach my kids math. I will teach my kids math. Somewhere there has to be a shift where the focus is on the kids and the ethics of the kids. It is going to require leadership. It is going to require some administrators who say, we're not going to do this anymore. And they're going to have to understand what it takes to switch it. And they're going to have to stay around. And here's another little pet peeve of mine. I don't want to hear about sustainability. Oh, but will it sustain? It sustains when the people who bring it in and champion it are still there. When those people leave, it goes away. And people say, oh, but how will you sustain this? Well, guess what? You won't. You won't unless there's somebody there doing that. So it takes the whole system. It takes administrators saying, we're not going to permit this kids to fail. It takes those administrators understanding what the evidence does say, what it should look like, who to believe. That's the hard one. Who do you believe? We never believe a publisher. The system has to change, but the leadership, bringing the leadership to the schools, and then helping the teachers get success. If the teachers aren't successful, then of course they're going to say, well, yeah, here's just another thing. We're going back to this. It was basic skills. It was, now we're here, now we're there. No. It really is much more complex and sophisticated. I don't know if that makes sense, but
it makes a lot of sense. It does start with the leaders. But I would say there's another place where it needs to happen, and that's the faculties of education. I find you very fascinating. I'm going to tell you that. And the reason I find you really fascinating, one of the reasons is because You taught in a faculty of education, and you're teaching teachers how to use DI.
It was a battle. In fact, my tenure was postponed because my director didn't like DI. Even though my record on record and in all the committees, and I was told this by someone who was the assistant chair of the faculty senate and then later became the chair, that they ignored that. And it was politics. And of course, my greatest accomplishment is that I survived all these people who wanted to go after me. When I was able to do it the way that I wanted to do it was because of a grant. I got a federal grant. When you bring in money, they leave you alone. So I got a federal grant that said you can redo your dual certification program. And at that time, I had a director who allowed me to do it. And I had partner schools because I'd been around a long time, these unbelievably great partner schools. It wasn't as great as I wanted it to be. It wasn't as thorough, but I could use the book. And people should know about this. The direct instruction reading book and the direct instruction math book do not teach you how to teach direct instruction. They do not. They are kind of what, in my mind, they fall under the category of design books. Here's how you design instruction in reading to address these objectives. Here's how, what we did in the math book is we took the strategies that these brilliant designers did, and we put them and tried to make them accessible to people who don't have the programs and who can't buy the programs or can't access. So if you wanted to use the strategies, we didn't design the math strategies. The designers did, the DI designers, Doug and Ziggy and Bernadette Kelly Solano, and they designed the strategy. And we said, here's the strategy. Here's how you now put it together. Here are example selection guidelines. Here are sequencing guidelines. Here are things that you need to know. But it was odd. I survived them, but I was not accepted. I mean, I had a group of people. My great colleague was Diane Kinder, who also got her degree at University of Oregon. She got her PhD at University of Oregon and was a direct instruction person. So when she came on board, I had colleagues that didn't hate what I did, but it was not pleasant to be there.
And it's hard to say how that could be fixed.
Well, the interesting part is that you would expect that professors of education would, in fact, pay attention to the evidence. That's the real crisis. I mean, there's that academic freedom thing, but when I went up for tenure, I wrote up my tenure narrative and I was talking about effective instruction, and I gave it to a friend of mine who was an English professor, and he went crazy and he said, well, why are you writing about effective instruction? Doesn't every professor of education talk about effective instruction? Isn't what they do effective? And it's like, yeah, well, see, that's the point. No, they don't. He then learned about sort of what happens in colleges of education, schools of education, that, no, the professors who are there don't seem to respect the science. And other things trump that. And then you kind of go, okay, well, then I'm going to teach what I know, and I'm going to teach my teachers. Now, they didn't all lead into situations where they could use DI. If they got special education positions, they were more likely. If they got general positions, probably not. But at least they knew something about what makes for good instruction.
You've done a great job. You can know that you taught them about the evidence and about project follow through and good methods to use with students. And it's also not just for students who struggle, right? Like, it works for all students.
I'm really glad that you pointed that out. Oh, yeah, this is not about just low performing kids. It's been accepted, much more readily accepted. If you have a challenging community, people are apt to look at things that they wouldn't look at typically because they're so, desperate, or they care and they want this to happen. They're concepts that are taught that that high performing kids don't know. Yes, I'm glad you brought that up. It's a misnomer. Designed for the naive learner, any naive learner, regardless how quickly they're going to acquire the skill.
Absolutely. We've had an amazing conversation, but I'll ask, is there anything else you want to add?
We had a lot. I think I really liked trying to get people to understand a little bit more about design. It's just not, that information isn't accessible. You can't see it. You can't see it when you open the programs. You can't really, because they're so scripted, you can't see it when you're watching it. It really is kind of the hidden heart of direct instruction. And so I couldn't like telling people about it. Like it's not just engaging kids. I mean, yes, you have to engage kids. Of course you have to engage kids, but engaging them in what? The what kind of matters.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you today. Thank you so much for sharing your time and all your knowledge and experience with us. It's just been an absolute honor to have you on.
Well, you've made it very easy to do.
Thank you. As always, we've included a resource page that has links to articles and books mentioned in the episode. If you enjoy this podcast, please consider showing your support by leaving a 5-star review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Chalk and Talk is produced by me, Anna Stokke. Transcript and resource page by Jasmine Boisclair and Deepika Tung. Subscribe on your favorite podcast app to get new episodes delivered as they become available. You can follow me on X, Blue Sky, or LinkedIn for notifications, or check out my website, annastokke.com, for more information. This podcast received funding through a University of Winnipeg Knowledge Mobilization and Community Impact Grant funded through the Anthony Swady Knowledge Impact Fund.